Hello and welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor, co-president and co-founder of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I'm coming to you live from the Stephen Uhl Friendly Atheist Studio in Freethought Hall, the Freedom from Religion Foundation's office in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mark Dan, FFRF's Director of Governmental Affairs based in Washington, D.C. Today on Ask an Atheist, the topic is how we won on the National Prayer Breakfast. We'll talk with Bishop Joseph Tolton, the Faith Engagement Coordinator for the Council for Global Equality and the President of Interconnected Justice. The Council for Global Equality and Interconnected Justice were key partners in FFRF's efforts to remove congressional support for the National Prayer Breakfast. The Council for Global Equality encourages a clearer and stronger American voice on human rights concerning and impacting LGBTQI communities around the world. And Interconnected Justice is a network of Pan-African activists working toward the reunification of Africans in Africa with people of African descent globally. So we'll talk how we successfully push back on the prayer breakfast and how Christian Dominionism threatens the global LGBTQ community. You can find the Council for Global Equality on Twitter at Global Equality and Interconnected Justice at InterconnectedJ. Bishop Tolton, we're honored to have you with us today.
It is an absolute pleasure for me to be here with you today, and I thank you, Dan, for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to work with you. And Annie Laurie, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here with you as well today. Thank you.
Nice to meet you. If you have any questions for Bishop Tolton during today's show, you can ask them in the comments on Facebook or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. This show is called Ask an Atheist, but today we also have a question for you, the viewer. How can the secular community aid LGBTQ equality worldwide? Put your answer in the comments and we'll try to read them over the air, provided that it's family friendly.
And remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, so we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections and don't endorse any such views that might be expressed here.
So after more than 70 years of covertly championing white Christian nationalism and Christian Dominionism, changes were made to the National Prayer Breakfast. That's thanks to pressure from a broad coalition of civil rights, religious, and secular organizations, which included FFRF, the Council for Global Equality, and Interconnected Justice, as well as our friends at American Humanist Association, American Atheists, Bayard Rustin Liberation Initiative, and Black Nonbelievers. The National Prayer Breakfast is separating from the highly compromised Fellowship Foundation that has put on the prayer breakfast since the 50s. So Bishop Tolton, why was opposing the prayer breakfast a high priority for your organizations?
The organizations that I work with at the point of intersection between the Council for Global Equality and Interconnected Justice is a deep commitment to protecting the human rights and the viability of a full existence for LGBTQ people. In Africa, it's often referred to as LGBTQI, with an emphasis on intersex people at large. And so understanding that there is a global economy of Christianity which has its focus on the oppression of queer people, particularly queer people in the African context, it was a no-brainer for us to be a part of this coalition because the prayer breakfast had been, up until this point, such a critical component in the infrastructure of the global economy of ultra-conservative, ultra-right Christians who have a political agenda to devalue the life and the possibility and viability of queer people globally.
So can you talk about the direct harm that has transpired from the prayer breakfast and the historically sponsoring organization, the Fellowship Foundation?
The Fellowship Foundation has created tentacles all around the world. And it's so very important for us to always remember that America has tremendous influence around the world. And one of those pockets of influence comes from religious institutions. The religious right perceived that they were losing the culture war here in the United States. And in the late 60s and early 70s, they made a very strategic decision that they were going to globalize America's culture wars and that they were going to create alliances around the world and that they were going to be able to, particularly in countries that were particularly pliable and easy to be taken advantage of, they were going to set up fiefdoms around the world to promote which they were promoting here in America under the guise of family values. Understanding the ways in which the culture wars were internationalized and globalized, that certainly brought us to this coalition because we understand the role of the prayer breakfast in this broader global conservative Christian ecosystem.
So it's fair to say that the Fellowship Foundation was a key player in developing this Christian Dominionist infrastructure. Is that correct?
It is absolutely accurate to say that. It is fair to say that. And that is absolutely the case. The prayer breakfast was a key factor, a key place of organizing for the global Christian Dominionist political agenda.
Right. And in 2010, you visited Uganda to fight anti-gay legislation there. When did you realize that the Fellowship Foundation and the National Prayer Breakfast were behind exporting LGBTQ hate to Uganda, and what tactics were they using to aid their efforts?
It was until 2010 that I made my first trip to Uganda. I met Bishop Christopher Sanyonjo here in the United States in June of 2010. And we spent a week together. And at the end of that week, he offered me an invitation to come to Uganda as an openly gay professional man of faith, as an ambassador of goodwill, connecting with LGBTIQ leaders on the ground, particularly leaders of faith who were trying to build resistance movements to the onslaught of homophobia that was distributed both through political, cultural, and religious channels. It was during my initial phase of work in East Africa between 2010 and the middle of 2011 that I began to do research and talk with lots of people who were involved on both sides of this issue. And that's where I began to really unearth and be able to identify that, in fact, America had not only financed the anti-gay bill in Uganda, but had financed this broader, as I've spoken to before, broader ecosystem. I do want to lift up the work of the film God Loves Uganda. That was a masterpiece, a wonderful documentary that really gave us tremendous insights and a fabulous expose of both the spiritual connections and the economic connections. It was the work of Jeff Charlotte as well, and also the research of Kapia Kayoma at Political Research Institute. All of that work between 2010 and 2012 really helped us to understand, identify, and do an in-depth analysis of this connection and its harm and the outcomes, as well as then devising strategies to push back.
So they were pushing the death penalty for homosexuality, correct?
It is so important that you lifted that up. That's absolutely correct. They already understood that because Uganda was an Anglophone country in terms of having been colonized by the British, there were holdover anti-sodomy laws. So same-sex intimacy or love was already against the law. They ratcheted things up with the Mahdi bill or the anti-gay bill, where yes, a couple of things. One, homosexuality was now punishable by death. But here's what's really important. Everyone in the society would be mandated to report someone who they thought was a homosexual. Let me quickly just do this analysis. Imagine if the three of us are living in the same floor of an apartment building, and Annie Laurie decides that she wants to identify me as being a gay person. She can call the police and report me. But the police would not only arrest me, they would arrest Dan for not having called me, because they would have accused him of actually trying to give me some kind of sanctuary or cover. So it was unleashing an absolute society-wide targeting of queer people. But what that also allows is, if we're in a political contest, and let's say we're both running for mayor of a particular town, you could then easily accuse me of being a queer person, and that could undo my campaign and give you an opportunity for an easy political victory. Obviously, people were going to fall into the temptation of using this issue for all sorts of reasons. Once the possibility of the legalization of this kind of mass targeting of queer people on a full society level was unleashed.
So I know Mark Dan has a few more questions, but I also wanted to confirm, is this still the law in Uganda?
This never was the law.
Okay, it was a proposed
bill, a Bahati bill, that it was signed, it was passed by the parliament, it was signed into law, but it was, the law was eradicated by the judiciary.
Well, that is a great relief, but it shows the harm of fundamentalist religion and government, certainly. I also wondered if you wanted to comment on the situation there. I do have a few more questions. I'm telling the control room, so don't move that. But I wonder if you could comment, Bishop Tolton, on the fact that the Anglican Africans are up in arms over this change in Great Britain by the Anglican Church, which disallows same-sex marriage, but has finally come down with this tiny baby step of saying that Anglican bishops could bless civil unions. And we have this revolt now by the African Anglican bishops. What is going on there?
That revolt is nothing new. Ever since Gene Robinson was elevated as an openly queer bishop in the Anglican tradition, you have had bishops from across the world who are a part of the Anglican communion who have been pushing back and resisting. So it is true that recently we've seen a particular groundswell of aggravated grievances coming from African bishops because Justin Welby, the head of the Anglican Church, has done exactly what you just said. So they, at any point in which we have some success, you're going to see an eruption of a pushback. And I will also say that 4 years of not having the American government clearly be a dam pushing back on the tidal wave of homophobia that was ready to be unleashed in Africa during the Trump administration, which decided to completely not participate in advancing the cause of human rights, broadly speaking, but certainly for queer people. That also deeply impacted and emboldened political and ecclesiastical structures to be far more aggressive in their anti-gay rhetoric, posture, and behavior.
So just one more question before I pass this back to Mark Dan. As a person of faith, Bishop Tolton, did you feel any concern that it would appear like you were betraying the faith-based community when you opposed the National Prayer Breakfast that was going on through the fellowship?
The very call on my life as a professional person of faith who is Black and queer and Pentecostal is unto itself a subversive spiritual mission, pushing back on the fundamentalist leanings of the church. So no, I had no concerns. That is simply what I do for a living. It is push back on this tidal wave of fundamentalist conservative oppression that the values of love and justice, peace and mercy and grace may abound in the Christian tradition.
Yeah, can't thank you enough for that perspective. And so with the National Breakfast, after so many scandals, from being involved with the Russian influencing campaign with Maria Butina to exporting LGBTQ hate that you talked about in Uganda and other countries, to cozying up to dictators such as Putin and Papa Doc, why do you think the National Prayer Breakfast finally started to change their tune?
It's a really, really great question. I think that at some point it became so clear to them that they had gone to such an extreme that to further that was really going to offer them, I think, diminishing returns. I also think that there's a struggle going on, even among the most conservatives of the conservatives. And I think that the issue of abortion is a really good one. How far, in fact, do we go? Have we gone so far that we're going to isolate ourselves, not only from the mainstream of America, but also cause some real tensions and rifts among those who are more moderate in the Christian faith? So there is tension between what we would call the right-wing Dominionists and those who are just kind of I guess we could term them mainstream conservatives. And I think that that rift was clearly articulated in what we saw happen with this rift causing the prayer breakfast to now be fractured.
Yeah. And we can't thank you and your organization's effort enough, and a lot of allies. And what we saw this year was just simply, as last year, more and more members of Congress, such as Nancy Pelosi and Tim Kaine, last year saw a lot of what we were talking about, began to walk off. We had more really good conversations with a lot of Hill offices together that clearly outlined a lot of the problems with the prayer breakfast, and the Hill followed suit. So if there is this rift of what's happening in the prayer breakfast and the Fellowship Foundation, and also as the larger Christian economy, as you put it, what do you think the changes to the prayer breakfast will mean to the international LGBTQ community?
I think that it offers us an opportunity to actually present a counter product, as it were. I think that there's a tremendous opportunity to now lift up the fact that not all people of faith are anti-LGBTQ, are anti-progressive, are anti-choice, are misogynistic, are oppressive, and want to turn the clock back. I think that this is a moment for us to lift up the capacity that we had to push back and actually deliver a victory, but also to lift up the fact that the Christian tradition can be one that is generative and peaceful, productive, and profitable for all people. This is a moment for people of faith who are queer and their allies and our allies to actually lift up a very strong counter-narrative.
Well, so let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that this new National Prayer Breakfast Foundation really wants to try to make inroads, make up to the LGBTQ community for what the fellowship has made of the former prayer breakfast. What could they do?
Well, first and foremost, I think that they've got to come clean. They would have to lift up their hands and become very, very clear in their witness regarding what they have done, the impact that it has had, and the harmful outcome. So that demonstration would have to be first and foremost for me. The second thing that they would have to do is make a significant financial investment in helping us to not only produce, but to distribute this counter narrative. That financial investment, always follow the money, would say to me that, in fact, they're really ready to change their ways. But I must say, I doubt that we'll see either of those things, because I do doubt how genuine even this new group is until they have proven themselves with concrete and sustainable action.
And of course, we have to point out that Jonathan Larson's reporting, if you go now to the website of the National Prayer Breakfast Foundation, every single one of the board members is somebody who's associated with the fellowship. So it does make us a little bit skeptical.
Indeed, it does, and we should, for a very good reason.
And so let's take a quick pause, and we'll reintroduce our guest today, Bishop Joseph Tolton from the Council for Global Equality and Interconnected Justice. We're talking about changes to the National Prayer Breakfast and the Christian Dominionist threat to the global LGBTQ community. And be sure to answer today's audience question in the comments. How can the secular community aid the LGBTQ equality movement worldwide? And now let's turn our discussion to threats the LGBTQ community faces on a global level. So, Bishop Tolton, together we were able to put Christian Dominionist forces on the back foot. That drove, that certainly registered with the National Prayer Breakfast Foundation, the new organization, and the Fellowship Foundation. Obviously, we don't expect Christian Dominionists to take this loss lightly. Who would you say is the main driver of Christian Dominionism worldwide, and how does it impact the LGBTQ community?
Let's unpack just for a moment what Christian Dominionism is. We certainly understand that there are evangelicals, and we say that they are far-right Christian fundamentalists. At one point in time, most Christians who are a part of that category and genre, we could refer to them as dispensationalists. They were Christians who wanted to prepare the world for its end. It was Jerry Falwell who actually moved many Christians who we call dispensationalists, and he migrated them to a theology that we now call Dominionism. The distinction is that Christian Dominionists believe that Christians should take moral, spiritual, and ecclesiastical control over society. So as opposed to preparing the world for the end, what Dominionists believe is that Christians have to take over the world so that we're able to mitigate, shall we say, the fallout from God's wrath and God's anger. Get society as close to being a society ruled by the laws of God, becoming the laws of the state. So this kind of activist notion of really blurring the lines between church and state and actually creating a theocratic leaning governments is the work of Christian Dominionists. And we see this now alive very much so in our own country with the radical Supreme Court that we have. The decision for the overthrow of Roe v. Wade was not grounded in any legal theory or in the law. It was really grounded in their particular moral, albeit religiously driven, convictions. And so it's really important that we're clear that this Dominionist movement is global. It is a global threat, and we are experiencing its push here, right in the United States right now.
And I would say probably you'd be using the term Christian Dominionism interchangeably with Christian nationalism. Is that right?
I think that that's right, yes. And I think that that is fair. I think that that is a fair use of those terms, particularly in our contemporary context. Yes, that is absolutely fair.
So how does somebody like Vladimir Putin use Christian dominionism to further his agenda?
Vladimir Putin is clear that there is a real strain of racism within Christian Dominionist ideology. And so, one, he used that because he knew that this strain of racism could be mobilized to further aggravate political tensions here in the United States. He has made very clear anti-Black Lives Matter statements because he understands the ways in which Black Lives Matter is politicized and at odds with white nationalism and with Christian dominionism. So he's used it in that regard to advance his cause. And I said often during the Trump administration, there is an arc of white nationalism from the Kremlin to the White House. He was able to construct that arc, and he was able to play in the waters of America's racial divide because he understood the racial or racially insensitive tendencies of white nationalists.
Right. So when we talk about connecting those arc, is there a connective arc between what Putin wants to do and then also the rise of LGBTQ hate in Africa and interconnected with the Fellowship Foundation and Christian Dominionists here at home?
Well, what Putin certainly wants to do as it relates to Africa is to be able to have access to Africa's resources at a discounted rate. And the way in which you do that is to create a particular relationship with dictators where you are going to supply them arms. Africa gets about 35% of its arms from Russia. And so as Russia is that supplier, supplying many autocrats that use those arms to undermine civil rights, to undermine a fair electoral process, that works for Putin. And he also understands that many of these dictators use the LGBTQ issue to their advantage from a political perspective on the ground in Africa. At the same time, you've got the Christian far right that are also using their anti-LGBTQ sentiments for their own reasons. So you have these interesting dance between autocrats in Africa, Christian fundamentalists globally, but particularly in America, and Putin, and their objectives do align as it relates to Africa, and LGBTQ people are caught right in the crosshairs of that.
So would you say the separation of church and state, democracy is a strong antidote to what Putin is trying to do across all over the world, and it's a way to bolster the LGBTQ community?
There is no question that the promotion of democracy is, in fact, the antidote, as well as there being the separation of church and state. But I must add another spice to that sauce, if I can. We also have to inspire people of faith of good consciousness to walk hand in hand with those that are nuns, to lift up a set of values that we believe should be foundational for informing the kinds of open and inclusive societies that we want to live in.
Well, that is music to our ears, Bishop Tolton, and we would be very proud to walk hand in hand with you on these issues. And Mark, did you have another question? Were you going to talk about Ukraine?
I think just kind of to tie up that conversation. So why is victory so critical in Ukraine for the LGBTQ community? And how would that victory in Ukraine impact the LGBTQ community in Africa?
I think that victory in Ukraine is incredibly important for all people who believe in democracy, who believe in the freedom that democracy implies, who believe in the honoring of the individual voice, and believe in the viability of each human being. If those are a set of beliefs that you embrace, and yes, LGBTQ people generally do embrace those values, then winning in Ukraine is incredibly important, because it's not just about victory for Ukraine, it is about victory for a set of ideals. And those ideals cover a sense of inclusion for which LGBTQ people are often champions and celebratory of, but so many others who really cleave to those ideals and understand why those ideals are so important and necessary to building open, inclusive societies with economies that work for all and a social environment that encourages people to live and to pursue happiness at its highest height.
So you have already given a solid endorsement for the separation of church and state. Could you describe maybe some of the ways in which your organizations try to bolster the separation between religion and government?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question for us. I think that we try to bolster it by being clear that one's religion will inform a certain set of values, but those set of values do not give you the right to then place in laws that would undermine another person's ability to fully embrace what is driven by their consciousness. Let me give you one good example, and that is prayer in schools. That is something that we are adamantly against, because obviously the majority of our kids in school are Christian. Most of the teachers are probably Christian. If we were to have a moment of prayer in school, we would actually be using government funds to essentially establish a certain type of prayer or a prayer to a specific God as being the standard, as opposed to a different kind of prayer. So the school and using government money is not the right place to have prayer, because it will lead to the establishment of one religion as the state religion, and we certainly oppose that. So that's just one micro example of how we walk the walk.
I am going to say amen to that. So, in many countries, religious leaders and organized religion are at the forefront of efforts to stigmatize and discriminate against the LGBTQ community. So how do your organizations approach advocacy in those contexts? And what strategies do you use to counter the harmful effects of religious intolerance, especially in the former Soviet Union and throughout Africa?
Absolutely. The best antidote, and I know for some this is not the answer they want to hear, but the best antidote to bad religion is good religion. Religion is pervasive in Africa. It is everywhere. And if in fact it is a continent where culturally people are kind of predisposed to, and for whatever reasons, religion is so kind of accessible and permeates everywhere, then let's give people good religion. Let's give people religion that is based on values of respect and truth and love and justice, and an understanding that they can never impose their specific religious beliefs on others, and that the marketplace should always be a fair, open, and neutral zone that is not controlled or manipulated by, or that one who has a particular religious belief has a particular advantage within the marketplace. The marketplace must be a neutral zone. And so we advocate strongly and aggressively for that position.
So Mark, my co-host who's remote, I think we need to go to questions. Is that okay with you now?
Sure, go for it.
We have some. Okay. So we have some questions for you, Bishop Tolton. One of them is, conservative anti-gay Christians quote Bible verses that say homosexuality is an abomination. How do you respond to that?
Oh my, I think I need to come back for a whole nother session to respond to just that. There are a couple of things. We certainly can go scripture by scripture, line by line, and verse by verse, because there are verses that rebuke the idea of homophobia. But what I start with is the fact that God is much bigger than the Bible, and that our Jewish brothers and sisters got it right with the tradition of wrestling with the scriptures. And John Wesley got it right. We use reason, tradition, and experience, and we juxtapose that to the scriptures to be able to distill an outcome that is spiritual and based on the ethics and the principles of the Christ. But the best answer I can give you from kind of a technical theological perspective is that Jesus the Christ said that the greatest commandment is that we love the Lord with all of our hearts, minds, and souls. The second commandment is that we love our neighbors as ourselves. And then the Christ said, let every commandment or everything that we believe be hung, rooted, or anchored in this principle of love. If it does not pass the love test, let it fall to the ground.
So we have another question for you. After the family's separation from the National Prayer Breakfast this year, what sorts of responses from the family can we expect? Will they launch a campaign for a more official National Prayer Breakfast?
Well, I certainly can't get into the head of the family, and probably wouldn't want to if I could. But if they are well-meaning, we are going to see them come forward with an extended hand, offering an olive branch to the LGBT community in ways that are tactical and substantive. And so I think we should wait and hope for that.
And then we have a final question, unless there's something else that's come in. While free-thinking members of Congress are still in the minority, is there a way to create a secular breakfast without the controversial entanglements?
Oh, I think that there absolutely is. And I would love to see ethical societies, let's say, for example, get together nationally and produce such an opportunity to invite Congress into a different kind of a setting for the purposes of us coming together around our moral concerns, harnessing our spiritual energy, and having an environment where that hopefully produces outcomes that are healthy as it relates to its influence on policy. I think that having more diverse groups, particularly groups that are liberal, of course, from my perspective, would be extremely, extremely helpful.
That's certainly something that Mark and I have talked about a lot, what we could do in that area. Well, I think this is the conclusion of our show, and we want to thank you so much, Bishop Tolton, for spending time with us today, and it was really a thrill to have you here.
Thank you so kindly for being so warm and gracious in receiving me today.
And we want to thank you so much for listening. And then we do have some little advertisements about other things that are coming up. And I'm going to have to look at my script here. Let's see. Sorry. This week on our broadcast TV show, Free Thought Matters, our guest is a 92-year-old outspoken freethinker and feminist and author, Barbara Walker. And here's a preview.
When I went to Sunday school, I doubted all the things I was told. It didn't make sense. I thought God was pretty nasty about, for example, the example of Abraham. Abraham was told to sacrifice his son because God demanded it. And I thought, if God told me to kill my child, what would I do? I would tell God to go to hell.
So you can watch Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the United States and, of course, on FFRF's YouTube channel and Facebook Live.
And don't miss Free Thought Radio. This week, Dan and Lori's guest is the head of the secular of the Secular Elected Officials Association, Leonard Presseberger. And you can find out here, and you can hear on Free Thought Radio a little bit more at ffrf.org/radio.
Yeah, that gets released Thursdays.
Fantastic. And of course, we have the We Dissent podcast that is coming up very soon. And you can join several leading secular legal voices, including our very own Rebecca Merkert, on the podcast as well with a lot of our secular friends. And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at www.ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If you're not, please join us. See you again next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.